There's a scandalous rumor out there that the Holy Game Awards have been rigged. That sounds like a lot of fun to me. What games will be snubbed? Will there be another huge rift between the judges and the gamers? And since the nominations are tomorrow, let's give some thought into what might or might not show up, and more importantly, why. Here are my official predictions for the Game of the Year nominations. Just ignore the other 50 videos with the same title on my channel. I will be deleting all of them except for the one where I got all the nominations correct. Reminder to self, take that part out of the video before you publish it. Let's start with predictions on what Keeley will be colluding with his pals on to upset gamers. My lock-in guarantees are Metaphor, ReFantasio, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Even with the gap between the media and those who play video games, there still managed to be a few games everyone liked. These two should be nominated in many categories, and likely win a few of them. Not only will these be Game of the Year contenders, they'll be adventure, RPG winners, they'll be in music, art direction, narrative, game direction, possibly performances too. I'll even go further. Metaphor may be the Game of the Year winner. Not necessarily my choice, but there is ample reason to think that this will be the journalist pick, and journalists have all the power. For the rest of the list, these ones are very likely. Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree is pretty obvious. When just days before the nominations are listed, they drop news that this year they will consider remasters, remakes, and DLC for every category. Everyone knows that this game is the reason they are saying it, and if this were a standalone game, it definitely would be worthy. Elden Ring wasn't just Game of the Year, it is one of the best 5 games of all time, and this DLC was more of that excellence. As well, Astrobot. It's a safe Game of the Year nominee choice, great game, very safe choice because everyone liked it, journalists and gamers. Now let's get to more controversial picks. These two games should be there, but are at the risk of not being there solely due to some on the judge panel already having a clear bias against them. These are the Hogwarts Legacy picks of the year. Stellar Blade was a massive breakout hit, a game that many thought was going to be just another generic action game with a sexy main character, and yet it became one of the best games of the first half of the year. However, it is also a game that activists hated. It was one of the first games of 2024 that was openly targeted by journalist lies and slander in an attempt to torpedo it and whip out a hate mob. Yet, it managed to overcome that assault just by being a great game and was very well received. Black Myth Wukong went through basically the same types of attacks, yet it became top Steam game of all time, one of the best-selling single-player games of all time, very well received overall. The game is beautiful, explores often untouched culture and stories, great attention to detail, fun combat, and it brought the world together. However, it was almost snubbed completely at the Golden Joysticks, another award show, so there is a possibility it will be snubbed here, though that will depend on how much they want to piss off gamers before the show even begins. Now, here's the controversial games that have no right being in the Game of the Year list, yet not only might, but many of these were already picked to be Game of the Year nominees before they even came out, and were accompanied by media blitzes to boost them before it became very clear the gaming audience reject them. You know these games for the drama around them. Dragon Age, the Veilguard, needs the PR of the Game Awards very badly, and journalists adore this game. Now, it is garbage. It ruined the reputation of the entire IP. It might be destroying the entire studio, has some of the worst writing ever seen, equally awful customization and combat. They also really wanted to prop up Star Wars Outlaws, and this is a game that was mostly just fun for some of the bugginess and the absolutely terrible stealth system. But there's one that might be there that also matches a recent rule change, and if they pick this one, it might be one of the biggest piss-offs of all time. 2024, we got the remaster for The Last of Us Part 2. Think about the type of people who are picking the nominees and winners. These are people who hate gamers. Some don't even play games. And you know they would kill to be able to give this game Game of the Year again. This is one of the most rewarded games of all time. This is the journalists' Lord of the Rings. And the only thing that might keep this game off of the list is if Keeley does not want to make the corruption accusations way too obviously true while he is still trying to turn this into a legitimate reward show. Because if this game even gets on the nominee list, that's it. It's over for the Game Awards. Nobody will ever take this seriously again. However, journalists would love to put this game there for the sole reason of owning the chuds, as they say. But wait, there's more. These are some games they really wanted to be there, but they failed so hard they can't even be considered. Dustborn had nobody play it. But if you check out the journalists, they reviewed it. There was a lot of journalist reviews for this game. They were treating it like a perfect game, and it completely matches their ideology. It is clear Dustborn was something they wanted to be a Game of the Year game. But there's something even worse. Nothing compares to Concord. Going to be blunt, Outlaws and Veilguard, they were backups. When Concord was being advertised, it was already the journalist's pick for Game of the Year. It had everything they wanted to see. And if it hadn't done so poorly it ceased to exist in just 2 weeks, tossing out hundreds of millions of dollars, Concord not only wasn't gonna be the nominee, at the start of 24, it had already been picked to be the Game of the Year. And they are still pissed about this one. Now, it would take forever to go after all possible nominees for all categories, but let's just mention some of the things we're going to see show up. Silent Hill 2 botched the visual style to appeal to modern audiences, but games media loves when that happens. Palworld should show up in the indies after how much of a splash it made, but this is another one games journalists never really liked, and there's always a risk of getting the Hogwarts Legacy full snub no matter how well a game is received by gamers. Hellblade 2 will probably show up for narrative, visuals, accessibility. Kill the Justice League should never show up for anything, but this game was part of the spark that lit this year on fire. Infinite Wealth could easily be in a few categories. Prince of Persia should show up. Echoes of Wisdom, I would be very surprised if this wasn't Adventure Game of the Year. Kenzera Zhao has a lot of journalist support and will probably appear in something. Hades 2 is beloved, but being an early access state, it might be saved for next year. And really, that's what they should have been more clear on instead of the DLC and remasters. At what stage is an early access game eligible? Because Baldur's Gate 3 was in early access for years before launch, and yet it was only considered for the launch year. But Palworld, its early access release, kind of made it feel like a full game this year. Like when you look at what Palworld got this year, it's definitely very different from what Baldur's Gate 3 got when it was launched in early access. So those are my predictions, not my picks. And guilty, serious cynicism there due to how the chosen judges have behaved. It is really disturbing to see how heavily anti-gamer sentiment is being represented and how there's basically zero counterbalance. Let's be blunt, the judge panel is stacked with openly extremist, woke media sites, but there's no extremists on the other side. There's no anti-woke, there's no even openly non-woke. Now, ideally, you would have a full group of neutral, trusted media. That's probably what would work for everyone. I prefer the absolute chaos of the next best thing. A balance of views across the spectrum, kind of like gamers. Let us return to a time of crazy debates between folk who will never see eye to eye and get away from this soft, never talk to anyone who disagrees on a single thing era. There is zero balance there. If this were a scale, one side would be up in the air and the other would be smashing through the ground. What would I nominate? And before you dare to accuse me of being biased, yes. Best Game Direction and Narrative, the nominees. Stellar Blade captures a lot of Nier Automata, while being its own game with some of the most fluid and enjoyable action combat I've yet experienced. It doesn't overdo it on cinematic storytelling like many Sony games do nowadays, and most of the time is spent killing zombie robots or exploring, or as we used to call it, playing the game. It introduced a new world and protagonist, and I went from really not expecting anything to eagerly awaiting a sequel. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth takes one of the most beloved retro games of all time and turns it into something completely different, yet also top quality, potentially winning every category it is in. Metaphor ReFantazio is a major surprise. Atlus has numerous Shin Megami Tensei lines, but Persona has always been their best known one. Metaphor takes many Persona elements to become its own new thing set in a medieval fantasy world. It built an audience who are intimidated by the unique modern school setting of Persona, and it is a great game, not quite as good as Persona 3 Reload or Persona 5, in my opinion, yet I can also understand why some like it even more than Persona, and I would not take any issue to see Metaphor win several categories. Wukong should be recognized for its game direction. This is a team that had a vision and executed it beautifully, and it was rewarded by global popularity. There's no question that create a game that shows the story of Wukong was accomplished. And if you are looking for immersion and authenticity, Wukong is the perfect game. Best Art Direction. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Persona 3 Reload, Metaphor, Wukong, this makes it a very tough fight. I want to add Unicorn Overlord to this. I love this game in general. I love Vanillaware as a studio that has been quietly making banger games for 2 decades, consistent in visual style and quality. If there is a year to recognize them, this is it. For managing to create an art style in the early 2000s that still manages to look absolutely amazing today. Best Score, Music, and Audio Design. Metaphor, ReFantazio, and Final Fantasy Rebirth are very hard to beat. Rebirth takes some of the best music in gaming and makes it grand and orchestral on another level, breaking the limitations of the earliest consoles. Metaphor, though, much like Persona, has a very distinct, unique musical style, and its combat music especially is just killer. Space Marine 2 should get some points for immersing you in the universe with its visuals and sound, and is also a very authentic Warhammer 40k game. Best Performance. Now, I barely pay attention to celebrities. I don't know the names of anyone who's going to be in any of this category. And this category is the one where Jeff brings up a couple of his big name friends and gives them half an hour to talk. And this year, there's going to be a lot of celebrities ready to give us a lecture, so I don't expect much here. But I want to give a shout out to Space Marine 2 for daring to give voice roles to men. And at a time when male presenting type A is the politically correct designation. Games for Impact. This is that joke category that they use to recognize their activism allies, and I could dig this if it was only successfully used to contain the nonsense. This is the only place I want to see Dustborn, Concord, the Veilguard, although Kill the Justice League kicking off Gamergate 2 may well be the biggest impact on the gaming industry this year. Best Independent and Debut Indie. Palworld needs to be recognized here. It's taking on a Goliath and is such a massive threat, Nintendo had to file a patent and sue them to try and stop them. It gave gamers something they badly wanted, and it was well rewarded. With the level of popularity it achieved, it is hard to believe this was an indie game making it. For a runner-up, I think it's fair to mention Animal Well. Best Ongoing Community Support and Mobile. Now, Final Fantasy XIV Dawn Trail, Genshin Impact, Honkai Star Rail, they've all kept up some major content releases. Zenless Zone Zero is the newest one. My initial take on it was, well, it's not bad, but it's a bit mixed. And yet, it has really started to grow on me. The combat is especially very fun to take part in, and there's some serious quality there overall. And I'm definitely gonna have to give nods to Burnus and Jane Doe, Instant Waifu, and Gyat Rat. Best Action, Stellar Blade, Space Marine 2, Black Myth Wukong. Best RPG, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Unicorn Overlord, Metaphor Refantasio, Persona 3 Reload, and Grand Blue Fantasy Relink. Best Fighting, Tekken 8, Dragon Ball Z Sparking Zero. Definitely Dragon Ball Z did some really impressive stuff this year, and it would be nice for them to get a pretty major nod for this game. Now, it's going to be a lot of fun just to find out how many of these games end up being in completely different categories, because there's always so much overlap between adventure, RPG, and action especially. Best Adventure Game, Zelda Echoes is the sort of fun I expect from a Zelda game. Yes, it stars Zelda and not Link, but it retains what these games are at their core, exploration and adventure. And this is the exact respectful way of making a game off a well-known IP without causing it any damage, and if anything, enhancing it. This is something that needs to be learned in the Western industry when they take over these IPs. And it's why Nintendo can make so many side games of their biggest IPs while keeping one of the most positive fan bases. Dragon's Dogma 2, it had some disappointing parts to it, but it's still fantastic. And this is where I'll have some pure bias. Dragon's Dogma 1 is one of my favorite games of all time. I absolutely love getting more of it, even if it is a little bit janky. Visions of Mana may not be my top Mana game of all time, but it is one of my favorite franchises, and this is just a beautiful, fun game. It's not too complex in combat or story, and it has a refreshing retro feel to it, while it has modern, colorful visuals. Astrobot can't avoid being mentioned. It's a pretty obvious choice for some. The game itself is great, and it's one of those gimmick games that really just works. It really takes advantage of the controller especially. The price for the game's length, I can understand being a point of contention with some people, but this really feels like a reboot of the entire 3D platform genre that was huge on the GameCube, PlayStation 1, and PlayStation 2. Best Family. Best Sim Strategy Sports VR. Now, if this were a test, this would be the question I randomly guess. So, Mario Kart VR Coach Manager. Did I get it? Best Multiplayer Game. Now, there's a lot of multiplayer games this year that we were told many times, live service games, multiplayer games, they just can't succeed anymore. But look at what we got. The First Descendant, Helldivers 2, it just got a lot of attention. It did something great. It brought gamers together, and they filled social media with in-character patriotism. This is the sort of fun nonsense that we need to bring back to gaming. This is how gaming used to be. You'd release a game like this, and people would just go crazy about it. And it would just be all in perfectly good fun. And everyone would understand that. They can't get it anymore. Activists and journalists were very angry with this game because they were watching someone else have fun. To them, that's like holy water poured over a silver cross, melted down into bullets for an assault rifle with a bump stock. It's the only way to scare off a furry. Innovation in Accessibility. This is the Participation Trophy Award for activists to pat themselves on the back for, and for everyone else to meme on while they clap for themselves. Now, I have no prediction here, but for the nominees, keep it on, champ. You can do it. Best Adaptation. Borderlands. For the accurate casting and managing to make Borderlands 3 look like a masterpiece in storytelling and dialogue. Most anticipated game of 2025. Civilization 7, Monster Hunter Wilds, Doom the Dark Ages, Crimson Desert, GTA 6, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, Gears of War E-Day, Path of Exile 2. Looking like a good year, not gonna lie. And the best part is, at least 2 of these games are not gonna be delayed. Reminder to take that out of the video if all of the games get delayed. And last of all, Game of the Year. My nominees are Dragon's Dogma 2, Unicorn Overlord, Metaphor ReFantasio, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Astrobot, Black Myth Wukong, and the winner of Game of the Year for 2024 is, drumroll, Stellar Blade. 2024 was a good year. One of the best years. I could put a dozen games on my Game of the Year list, and it has been a long time since I've been able to go from game to game all year long and enjoy all of it. Heck, I still have a backlog. Whatever we see tomorrow for nominees, a year of games like this is something to be celebrated. This gives me a lot of faith in the industry. Yes, there's been a lot of negativity over the state of it, especially the journalists and the activists, the wokeism, the Western AAA studios that are falling apart. But if you look at the big picture, it is just as important to call it the great stuff as it is the awful stuff. And 2024 knocked it out of the park.